And we're back. The MGP fighter here. You can find me at DAMGPFIGHT. Right now we are looking at figure 6-1A, conceptual site model plan, Rockaway Park manufactured gas plant site. And basically it's going to have some interesting things in regards to what I've already informed you of on part 1 of this two-part series on groundwater flow, so on and so forth. We're going to look at the map key. First we're going to look at the direction, the compass here. And the compass clearly shows north is moving upward in the shot. That's very important because north is the or northeasterly should I say, is the groundwater flow direction. And we look at the key map. These pink arrows designate the approximate groundwater flow direction, or approximate groundwater flow direction, and the green, you know, designates surface drainage, self-explanatory, the railroad, chain link fence, so on and so forth, historic features. We don't need to get into that. If we pull back, we're going to see those train tracks as we pull back, and you're going to kind of get an overview of the site. Of course, my property was located in that area there, which is vacant at the time of this shot. Okay, but has since been erected. That St. Mark's Avenue is actually Rockaway Beach Boulevard. They're using the historical name St. Mark's Avenue. And you can see Beach 109th Street. You can see the elevated MTA train and Rockaway Freeway. Now if you remember, the pink arrow is the approximate groundwater flow direction. If we look here, what do we see? We see a pink arrow facing southward. Okay, that's not the direction of groundwater flow, but yet that pink arrow says there's groundwater flow to the south, onto Rockaway Freeway, off the site, onto Rockaway Freeway, across the elevated train tracks. And if you remember the first shot I showed you, you can see the extent of the groundwater plume. If you look at it and I pull back a little more, you can see the groundwater plume extends across the train tracks, right in between the two tracks. You can see Rockaway Freeway. Okay, and this is figure 6 of the 10/2004 record of decision, and this is the extent of groundwater plume, and you can see all the information there. It's formerly owned by Lilco when this was all generated, but it's now owned by National Grid. And you can see the plume, the extent of the plume there. And if I point here, there are a number of homes here in very close proximity, which mine is one of them, that I suspect has contaminated my property. Okay, so I'm looking at this groundwater plume and the overview of the site. That's the plume. You see it extends southward off the site. This is the southern perimeter of the site again, right here, and you can see if it's north, the groundwater flow is north, as this figure shows north. You'll see that the southern perimeter is here and the groundwater plume does extend south. And a possibility why that is occurring is because, as in this shot here, okay, it says peak high tide, and you can see the arrow pointing southward. Peak high tide on Jamaica Bay. When the tide rises on Jamaica Bay, it causes a reversal in groundwater flow. Okay, and if we go up here, we can see it again, and we can see the two-way arrow where it says high tide. You can see it pointing southward towards the bottom of the shot, which is south, and you can see low tide pointing northward towards Jamaica Bay. And of course, this site is leaching contaminants into Jamaica Bay. Okay, without a doubt. Additionally, in the remedial design, they were looking at encasing this entire site with a wall that they would drive underground to keep the contaminants inside from escaping or migrating. They claimed they couldn't do it on the south side of the site to protect the residents from that groundwater migrating southward onto their properties. DC National Grid alleged that the reason why they couldn't build a wall, an underground wall, to encase that site was because south of these properties is the Atlantic Ocean. Alright? 1 block south is the Atlantic Ocean. And allegedly the Atlantic Ocean at high tide, it travels under our homes and it rolls onto the site. Probably halfway across the site to probably 3/4 across the site. And if they were to put a wall, drive a wall subsurface to contain the contaminants on the site. When that tide on the Atlantic did reach high tide and it attempted to roll onto the site, the fact there was a wall there and the tide could not proceed northward onto the site, it would merely encounter that wall and just merely start to rise in elevation, which would basically flood our homes. And they call that, or they refer to that as groundwater mounding. I'm not a hydrogeologist, but I'm just basically repeating what the information I obtained from National Grid DEC. Okay, so that was their basis for not putting this southern wall around the and they call it the 360 model, I believe it what it's called. The 360 meaning 360 degrees, an entire wall around the entire site. And the reason was because the Atlantic tide, so on and so forth, and the tidal influences of groundwater on the site, flooding. Question: if indeed high tide on the Atlantic causes the tide to roll onto the site, probably half to 3/4 of the way across the site, when that tide receded, when at low tide, when those waters receded back down to the Atlantic Ocean, would they not cause contaminants and groundwater to be moved back towards the ocean? Would they not take contaminants back towards the ocean with it, or do these contaminants magically know they have to stay on site? This is not coming from a scientific perspective. This is coming from a basically reasonable perspective, the rationale of a reasonable thinking man. If the tide did enter the site and at some time receded back towards the ocean, which is south, wouldn't it bring contaminants with it? This is National Grid's allegation or alleged reason for why they couldn't put this 360 to implement the 360 degree plan to encase the site all around with underground wall to keep contaminants on. So this document clearly shows groundwater flow to the south. We come to this document here. This clearly shows the southern perimeter of the site and that the groundwater has moved southward across the railroad tracks. I think my home is in danger. There's been contamination found on my property at almost 3 times the level of the state guidelines. National Grid alleges no. DEC alleges no. They attempt to place blame on a gas station that was once located right there. It says St. Mark's Avenue and Beach 109th, but it's actually Rockaway Beach as a historical name. If groundwater flows north, how does these contaminants end up flowing westerly onto my property, which is probably about here? Okay, how does it, if it's supposed to move north in that direction upward, how does it end up here on my property, which is a westerly direction? And the groundwater flow actually is mostly north but slightly east as well. And you can see from the diagram here, you can see that the groundwater also moves east in this direction at low tide. It's northeast at low tide. Right there you have it. So my question is, does 1 and 1, and pardon me for that, does 1 and 1 still equal 2, or does it equal 6 as National Grid alleges? If National Grid is correct, then 1 and 1 equals 6. If I'm correct, 1 and 1 still equals 2. I'm a layman. I'm not a hydrogeologist. But just ponder what I've just shown you, and just look at the documents which clearly show a southern flow of groundwater, and you determine for yourself whether we are being apprised of what is actually taking place on this site. Okay, this is the MGP fighter. You can find me MGP, or excuse me, DA MGP FIGHT. I'm signing off.